Welcome to our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're really going to be looking at how our faith impacts our relationships.
Okay.
And we are going to be using this book called Jesus-Centered Relationships, Friendships, Toxicity, and Singleness.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of this?
I have, yeah.
It's pretty interesting. It really pushes you to think about, are the people you surround yourself with, are they actually helping or hurting your spiritual journey?
Right.
I mean, it even uses the word like toxic, which is pretty intense, right?
Yeah, no, it definitely grabs your attention. I think
Yeah.
that's the point, though, right? To
Yeah,
make us stop and really evaluate those dynamics in our
for
lives.
sure.
Because sometimes we can be so caught up in just having relationships that we forget to think about the quality of them.
Yeah, that's true.
Are they drawing us closer to God, or are they kind of subtly pulling us away?
So how do we even begin to figure that out? I mean, the Bible talks about loving everyone. So where do we draw the line between unconditional love and recognizing when a relationship might be doing more harm than good?
Yeah. That's where discernment comes in. And that's something that I think this book really emphasizes. It's not about judging people, but it's about recognizing patterns and being honest with ourselves about, the impact certain relationships have on our spiritual well-being.
So like if I'm feeling constantly drained or like I'm compromising my values to maintain a certain friendship, that's a red flag.
It's definitely a sign to pause and reflect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this book offers a powerful analogy, I think, to help us understand the kind of friendships we should be seeking. Iron sharpening iron from the book of Proverbs.
Right.
It's this idea that true Christian friendships should challenge us, encourage us, and help us grow in our faith.
Okay, I get that. But I always thought of iron sharpening iron as more about constructive criticism,
Uh-huh.
not necessarily the overall health of a relationship.
Well, I mean, it definitely is about that, but think about it. Iron can't sharpen iron if they're not constantly rubbing up against each other.
Okay, yeah.
So it's about consistently pushing each other to become better versions of ourselves,
Okay.
both spiritually and personally.
So how does this play out practically? What does iron sharpening iron actually look like in a modern friendship?
Yeah, think about the relationships in your life that truly energize you.
Okay.
The ones where you can be completely vulnerable, share your struggles, share your victories, and know that you're going to be met with support and encouragement, not judgment. Those are the relationships that have that iron sharpening iron quality.
So it's not just about having friends who share your faith, but friends who actively challenge you
Yeah.
to grow in your faith.
Exactly. It's about mutual growth and accountability.
Sure.
And this doesn't mean you need to ditch all your friends who aren't on the exact same page as you spiritually.
Right.
But it does mean being intentional about cultivating those relationships that inspire you to draw closer to God.
Makes sense. What about those friendships that maybe aren't quite so healthy?
Yeah.
I mean, the book uses that word toxic, which is a pretty strong term.
It is strong.
When does a challenging friendship cross the line into toxic territory?
That's a great question. It's important to remember every relationship's unique, right?
Sure.
There's no one-size-fits-all definition of toxic, but there are some common warning signs, like feeling consistently drained, manipulated, or like you're walking on eggshells around someone.
So those subtle feelings of discomfort, those actually matter.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we can brush those off as being too sensitive or overthinking things.
Yeah, intuition is powerful, I think. If something feels off in a relationship, it's worth paying attention to those feelings.
Hmm.
And this book highlights, I think, a really simple yet profound question to ask yourself. Does this relationship draw me closer to Jesus or further away?
Wow. Yeah,
I know, right?
that's really helpful. It cuts through all the noise and gets right to the heart of the matter.
It helps us shift our focus from those external factors to the internal impact
Yeah.
the relationship's having on our spiritual lives.
So if the answer to that question is further away, what then? Does that mean we have to cut off all contact with that person? It just seems harsh, especially with someone we've known for a long time.
It's not always about ending the relationship completely, but it might mean having some difficult conversations, setting boundaries, or creating some distance.
But how do we do that without coming across as judgmental or unloving?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're called to love our neighbors, right?
Absolutely. And this is where things can get really tricky. I think it's about finding that balance between loving someone and protecting our own well-being, both emotionally and spiritually. Recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to create some space for healing and growth.
For both people.
Yeah, for ourselves and for the other person.
So if I'm in a friendship that's starting to feel draining, where do I even begin?
The book really emphasizes prayer. as that first step.
Okay.
Asking God for discernment to see the situation clearly and for guidance on how to proceed.
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, sometimes our own emotions can cloud our judgment.
Right.
We might be holding on to a friendship out of guilt, obligation, or fear of being alone.
And I think that's something a lot of people struggle with, especially in our culture where we're often told to never give up on a friendship no matter what.
It's a noble sentiment, but sometimes holding on too tightly can actually cause more harm than good. Letting go, or at least creating some distance, can be an act of love.
For both people.
Both for ourselves and for the other person, it can create that space for both parties to reflect, heal, and grow.
So we've covered the importance of seeking out friendships that nurture our faith
Uh,
and recognizing when it might be necessary to step back from relationships that are causing harm. But what about those who are single?
yeah.
Where do they fit into all of this?
That's a great segue into, I think, the next section of the book, which challenges the common perception of singleness as just a waiting room for marriage.
Right.
It reframes it as this unique opportunity for spiritual growth and service.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into that a little bit.
All right, so let's explore how this book helps us see singleness as a gift, not a burden. So, picking up where we left off, host speaker.
Yeah, it's interesting how we often think of singleness as this like temporary state.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's all about finding the one and then like living happily ever after.
Mm-hmm.
But this book really flips that script, doesn't it? It definitely challenges the typical fairy tale narrative. It invites us to see singleness not as like a lack of something, but as a season overflowing with its own unique blessings and opportunities.
Yeah, and I can already sense some listeners rolling their eyes like, easy for you to say. You're not the one swiping through dating apps every night.
Right.
But honestly, I am curious, how does the book actually make the case for singleness being a gift? That seems like a hard sell.
Well, it starts by kind of reframing our perspective on what it means to be complete.
Okay.
Our culture often equates completeness with being in a romantic relationship,
Yeah.
as if we're somehow less than whole without a partner. I've definitely felt that pressure. Like there's this invisible timer ticking away, and if I don't find someone by a certain age, I've somehow failed.
And that's exactly the kind of thinking this book challenges. It reminds us that our worth and identity are found in Christ alone.
Right.
We are complete in Him, regardless of our relationship status.
Okay, that makes sense, like theologically, but practically speaking, how does that translate into actually enjoying singleness? It's easy to feel lonely or like you're missing out when you're constantly bombarded with images of happy couples.
Right. And that's where I think the book's emphasis on purpose comes in.
Okay.
Instead of focusing on what we lack, it encourages us to ask ourselves, what unique opportunities does this season of singleness offer me?
Okay. So instead of waiting for the one, we should be focusing on becoming the one God created us to be.
Exactly. It's about investing in our relationship with God, pursuing our passions, serving others, and really leaning into all the freedoms that singleness affords.
So like if I've always wanted to travel the world, volunteer overseas, or go back to school, but I felt held back because I didn't have a partner,
Right.
singleness could actually be like the perfect time to do those things.
Precisely. Singleness offers a certain flexibility and freedom that can be incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
It allows us to be fully present in the moment, to pursue our calling with undivided focus, and to say yes to opportunities that might not be possible later in life.
I see that. What about like the flip side? Those times when singleness feels less like a gift and more like a burden? What about the loneliness, the longing for companionship, that feeling of being left behind while everyone else is getting married and starting families?
Yeah.
You know?
Right, and those feelings are completely valid. The book doesn't pretend that singleness is always easy,
Right.
or that those desires for intimacy and connection just magically disappear.
So how do we navigate those tough emotions? Do we just like grit our teeth and try to ignore them?
I don't think it's about denying or suppressing those feelings, but it's about processing them in a healthy way. The book really emphasizes the importance of bringing those emotions to God, being honest with Him about our struggles, and allowing Him to comfort us and meet our needs.
I think that's huge. We often try to find our fulfillment in other people, but ultimately only God can truly satisfy the deepest longings of our hearts.
Absolutely. And the book actually draws inspiration from the Apostle Paul, who was unmarried and yet lived an incredibly rich and impactful life.
Yeah, Paul's often held up as like the poster child for singleness.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes we forget that he also expressed moments of loneliness and longing. He even wrote about the struggles of celibacy.
He did. He was human, just like us. But what's so inspiring about Paul is that he didn't let his singleness define him or limit his potential. He saw it as an opportunity to serve God wholeheartedly. and he accomplished incredible things for the kingdom.
It's a powerful reminder that our relationship status doesn't determine our worth or our ability to make a difference in the world.
And this doesn't mean everyone who's single is called to be like a globe-trotting missionary like Paul.
Right.
We all have unique gifts and callings, and singleness provides the space to discover and develop those
Yeah.
without the distractions or commitments that come with being in a relationship.
So it's about embracing our own unique journey, trusting that God has a plan for us, whether we're single or married.
I think so, yeah. And there's a beautiful parallel, I think, between the book's advice for navigating toxic relationships and its perspective on singleness.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, in both cases, it's about setting boundaries. In toxic relationships, we set boundaries to protect ourselves from harm. And in singleness, we set boundaries with societal expectations and cultural pressures that tell us we're not complete or successful without a romantic partner.
Oh, that's so insightful. It's about like defining our own worth and not letting external factors dictate our happiness or fulfillment. Yeah.
Exactly. Whether we're single or in a relationship, it's crucial to guard our hearts and minds, to be intentional about the influences we allow into our lives, and to prioritize our relationship with God above all else.
I love that. So to recap, we've talked about the importance of seeking out friendships that sharpen us spiritually, recognizing when a relationship might be toxic, and embracing the unique opportunities of singleness.
Yeah.
How does all of this tie back to the idea of Jesus-centered relationships?
That's a great question. It leads us beautifully into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore how to make Jesus the foundation and guiding principle of all our connections.
Okay, cool. Let's continue this in just a bit. Okay, so we're back, ready to kind of wrap up our deep dive into Jesus-centered relationships. And as we've been talking, I've been realizing something. It's not just about like finding the right people
Yeah.
but it's about becoming the right person ourselves.
That's huge, yeah. And I think that gets to the core of what this book is all about. It's not a guide to manipulating people or forcing them to fit into some perfect mold.
Right. It's about like letting our own transformation in Christ kind of influence how we approach all our relationships, whether it's with friends, family, romantic partners, even just acquaintances.
Yeah, exactly. It's about that ripple effect.
Yeah.
When we make Jesus the center of our lives, it naturally flows outward and impacts how we interact with everyone we encounter.
Okay, so that sounds great in theory, but how do we actually do that? What does it actually look like to make Jesus the foundation of our relationships?
Well, the book offers a few, I think, key principles. One of the most important is intentionality.
Okay.
It's about actively seeking God's guidance in our relationships, praying for discernment, and making choices that align with his will.
So it's not just about letting things happen passively, but like proactively seeking God's direction, making conscious decisions about who we allow into our inner circle.
Exactly. And it also involves being mindful of the values we're embodying in our interactions.
Okay.
Are we reflecting Christ's love, grace, and compassion? Are we being honest, trustworthy, and forgiving?
Well, those are high standards. I mean, we're all human. We're going to mess up sometimes.
Right.
Does that mean we're doomed to fail at having Jesus-centered relationships?
No, not at all. It's a journey, not a destination. The book really emphasizes grace, both for ourselves and for others.
Okay.
We're all works in progress, and God meets us right where we are.
That's encouraging. I think sometimes we get so caught up in like striving for perfection that we forget about the power of God's grace to transform us.
And that's where I think the book's emphasis on prayer comes in. It's not just about asking God to fix our relationships, but it's about inviting him into the process, allowing his spirit to work in and through us.
So it's about surrendering our need for control, trusting that God knows what's best for us and allowing him to guide our steps.
Now, as we surrender our relationships to God, we also start to see them through a different lens.
Okay.
Instead of viewing them as transactions or sources of personal fulfillment, we begin to see them as opportunities to reflect God's love to the world.
Yeah, I like that. So it's not just about what we can get from our relationships, but about what we can give through them.
Exactly. And that's where I think things get really exciting. Because when we shift our focus from me to we, from consuming to contributing, our relationships become channels of God's grace and love.
That's cool. It's like our relationships become little outposts of the kingdom, spreading hope and healing wherever we go.
And I think that's a powerful antidote to the negativity and division that often plague our world.
Right.
When we prioritize Jesus in our relationships, we become agents of reconciliation, bridge builders, and peacemakers.
Well, this has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I have a whole new framework for understanding and approaching my relationships.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, it's not about having all the answers or figuring everything out overnight. It's about taking those small steps, seeking God's guidance, and allowing Him to work in and through our connections.
So true. Is there anything else you think our listeners should take away from this deep dive into Jesus-centered relationships?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Healthy, thriving relationships don't just happen by accident. They require intentionality, effort, and a willingness to surrender our own desires to God's will.
That is so well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today on this journey of exploring how to make our relationships reflect the heart of Jesus.
It's been my pleasure. And to all of our listeners, may your relationships be filled with God's love, grace, and transforming power.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep diving deep.